Hello, welcome to Economics 313. Today we're going to talk about the introductory material in chapters 1 and 2. And we're going to start with a fairly simple question. Why study macroeconomics? And there's several answers to that question. You might have seen a few of these in your introductory course, but in any case, for one reason is we're going to want to understand how output is determined. One of the key indicators of health of the economy, what makes output change over time, what makes it go up, what makes it go down, what makes it grow faster, what makes it grow slower, and importantly, how can we use monetary and fiscal policy to stabilize output employment over time? We know that sometimes we have these big boom periods that are inflationary. Other times we have these recessions that cause lots of unemployment. What can we do from a policy perspective to stabilize output and employment over time? And is monetary policy enough? What's the role of fiscal policy? Is taxes better than government spending? Lots and lots of questions like that we'll answer throughout the course. And our macro tools, our study of macro will help us understand those things. Particularly, I'm particularly interested in this course about questions about policy, how we can use policy to make things better. Well, I've already mentioned this, but a second reason for studying macro is to understand employment and unemployment. Unemployment is certainly costly to the households that it hits, and what makes employment grow over time, all those sorts of questions. So again, we want to build a model. We'll build a model of the labor market that really helps us to understand how these things are determined and how it's related to output and output growth and all those sorts of questions. So if we want to understand, how can we change the unemployment rate? It's been really high for a long time, say. Well, how can we bring it down? Those sorts of questions. Prices and inflation are another thing we can use a macroeconomic model to understand. So what determines prices? How do aggregate demand and aggregate supply interact to determine the price level? How are prices determined? And how is inflation determined? And how can we use policy to affect inflation? Does fiscal policy cause inflation? Maybe, maybe not. Does monetary policy cause inflation? It can. And well, exactly how and what can the Fed do about it? Is it important to stabilize inflation? What if you have an inflation problem at the same time you have an unemployment problem? Which target should you choose? If you have to choose one over the other, those sorts of issues. Interest rates is another key variable that we want to understand. What determines interest rates in the money markets? How is it that the supply and demand for money determines the interest rate? Or the supply and demand for maybe it's loanable funds, or maybe it's something else. Exactly what is it that determines the interest rate? How do financial markets do that? And how do interest rates interact with output and unemployment, and even prices and inflation? If interest rates are too low, we might get inflation, we might get higher output, might get higher employment. Interest rates are higher, that would do the opposite. See, interest rates have a big effect on investment by businesses, on the consumption of houses by households, on consumer durables like boats and cars and refrigerators, those sorts of things. And so as we change interest rates, we might be able to change it through say, monetary policy, or even fiscal policy perhaps. We might be able to change some of these other variables. So not only are we interested in these on an individual basis, we're going to want to know how they interact in a grander model. And we'll look at all those questions. Exchange rates. And the balance of trade. Whether we have a trade deficit or a trade surplus. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the exchange rates and the balance of trade. We have two other courses, Econ 480, Econ 481, that look at those questions explicitly throughout the course. It's a big topic. I couldn't do both domestic macro justice and do international macro justice at the same time. But we won't entirely ignore these questions. Whenever they're important, say for a question we're looking at, we're going to want to understand how this works. So we'll spend some time looking at international issues, exchange rates in particular, but we're not going to focus on this the way you would in other courses. Putting this sort of together, output growth inflation, and unemployment are key indicators of the economy's health. And so if we want to figure out how healthy the economy is it doing well, is it doing poorly? These are variables we'd want to look at: output growth, inflation, and unemployment. And then if we think that the economy's not doing very well, then we're going to want to know how to use policy to change output growth, inflation, and unemployment. So again, those are some of the main questions we'll be looking at. Now, as we study macro, we're going to want to divide the time periods we look at into three different time periods. So we're going to want to look at a very short run, a medium run, and long run. So we'll start the course really looking at short run macro. And short run, we're going to be holding some things constant, like prices and some other sorts of things. The medium run, we'll let some of those things change and not others. And then in the long run, everything can change. And I'll be a lot more specific about this later. But just for now, understand that we're going to have sort of three different sections in the book divided into short run macro, medium run macro, and long run macro. And for instance, like monetary policy, we think has an effect in the short run, but maybe not in the long run. And what's going on with that in the medium run? And so depending upon which time frame we're looking at, we're going to get different answers to certain questions. So it's going to be important to distinguish these three things. So it's really understanding, I guess the point I'm making is understanding that it does matter to distinguish these time periods is one of the reasons to study macro. When someone says, what effect does monetary policy have? You have to say, well, do you mean in the next 3 months? Do you mean in the next 10 years? Because those are very different questions. And if you don't understand macro, you're not going to understand that you can't just give a single answer to some of these questions. We're going to start with a very simple model. For instance, a model where prices can't change, and then we'll build up to a more complex. We'll add more and more bells and whistles to it to get a more and more realistic model. Now, the trick in modeling is not to put every effect in the world into a model, but to isolate those things that are the most important. So we're going to build up to a more complex model that includes all the things we think are important to understand the questions that we want to answer. So what I'm saying is that the point is not theory for theory's sake. It's not just that we want to do theory just to prove that, oh, here's a bunch of macro theory, aren't we smart people, because we could do all this math. We're not going to do a lot of mathematics in the course. We'll do a little, but we're not going to do a lot of heavy calculus or anything like that. But, you know, it's not just to show off that you have those tools. You know, the point's not theory, though we want to understand it. We want to understand it if you can't read that. It's useful for understanding how the economy works, which is what we want to do. How the economy works. And running out of room here. It's going to be a problem in here. I don't have a lot of board space with a camera. So the point is not theory for theory's sake. The point is to understand how the economy works and to investigate how monetary and fiscal policy can change the economy for better or worse, hopefully better. Though not always, as we shall perhaps see. So we'll look at questions from a policy perspective, such as, what if government spending goes up or down? How does that affect the economy? How do tax changes? Which is better? If I want to stimulate the economy, should I increase government spending? Should I lower taxes? Should I do some combination of both? What's the most effective mix of policy? What happens if the Fed changes the target interest rate? It's been, you know, what happens then? Say it's shooting at a 2% interest rate target. Right now it's a bit below that, but who knows what it'll be later. exactly what happens if the Fed changes those monetary and fiscal policy targets. If the Fed tries to lower the unemployment rate, will that cause inflation? Under what conditions? Will it cause inflation? When won't it cause inflation? When is it a good thing? What is quantitative easing? How does that work? We talk about Federal Reserve policy. What's the zero lower bound, and how does that affect policy if we're stuck at what's called the ZLB? All those sorts of questions are things we're going to want to understand. Models are also useful for understanding current events. What if the price of oil goes up or down? How does that affect the economy? What if there's a government shutdown because of politics? How might that affect the economy? If there's a financial meltdown like we had in the Great Recession, how might that affect the economy? If there's a hurricane, how might that affect the macroeconomy? And it knocks out a bunch of infrastructure, say oil infrastructure or something along those lines. How is that going to affect the economy? And so those are sort of the main things that we want to use it for. Now the models we're going to build are useful for understanding not only just the US, but also the economies of other countries and the world economy. That's just a different level of what we call aggregation. Which brings us to what is macro, this question of aggregation. So hopefully you're convinced, if not, maybe the book will do a better job of convincing you, that macro is a worthwhile thing to study. Okay, but what is macro? So that's, instead of why study macro, what is macroeconomics? So there's two branches, and there's actually a third if we include econometrics. But mostly we divide macro into microeconomics and macroeconomics. And I guess it's easiest to understand what macro is by contrasting the two. So let's start with microeconomics. What is microeconomics? So microeconomics is the study of individual decision-making units, such as individuals, households, and firms. So it's a study of individual, that individual term's important, decision-making units. Like a household, individual, or a firm. So macro is the study of the entire economy. So it's not the size that matters, it's the level of aggregation. Some firms in the world have bigger output than entire countries, believe it or not. The study of that firm, that individual firm, would still be micro. The study of that country and all the different things it produces all at once in aggregate would still be macro. So it's not, micro kind of means small, macro kind of means big, but it's really the level of aggregation, not the size of the thing we're studying. And what do I mean by this level of aggregation? So we're going to look at these abstract things. We're going to look at GDP, which is the total output of goods and services in the economy. We'll define it more explicitly later. And we're going to look at the price level, and that's the average price of all goods in the economy. And so we're going to look at the relationship between GDP and the price level and attach some importance to that. Well, why? I mean, you can't go to the store and buy a unit of GDP and pay the price level for it. There's no such thing. These are abstract quantities. You can't buy a unit of GDP and pay the price level for it. It's just not possible. So these are abstractions. Well, the reason we're doing this is we want to understand, see, when there's inflation, not all prices are going up. A lot of prices are going up, most prices are going up, but some prices could even be falling. When there's inflation, what we mean is on average, all prices are going up. When GDP is going up, some firms might be contracting, but on average, output's going up. So we're looking at these abstractions to really track what's happening on average across the economy. What makes, in general, not for every single firm or every single good, what in general makes prices go up or down on average? What in general makes output go up and down on average? And for that, we use aggregates, averages, or totals across the economy. So the total output of goods and services is GDP. So we're going to somehow add up apples and oranges into some one big number that says this is output for the US. We're going to say here's the average price of all those goods in the US. We're going to do the same thing with interest rates. We'll talk as though there's one interest rate and ask, well, what makes the interest rate go up or down on average? We don't mean necessarily that every interest rate in the economy is going up or down. We mean that on average, interest rates are going up, or on average, interest rates are going down. So again, we're using these aggregates to try to keep track of what's going on average across the economy. And it's the study of the aggregation and the study of them that distinguishes macro from micro. Okay? So let's go into some of these aggregates and talk about how they're measured. So if we're gonna study and attach importance to these aggregates, then we need to know how these aggregates are determined. So we're going to start with GDP and look at how GDP is determined, and then we'll talk about prices and inflation and how those are determined in the economy. Okay, so aggregate output, how is it measured? It's called, and you already know this more than likely, GDP. And it can be measured in three ways. All of which theoretically give you the same number. In the real world, there can be some statistical discrepancies because some of this is done with sampling, but theoretically, these are all the same. So GDP, and this is most likely, this is the definition that most people use the most, is the value of final goods and services produced in organized markets, produced and sold, you might say and sold, in organized markets, in the US, within the US, during a given period of time. So we're just going to basically add up the value of the output of all the firms in the economy and all the goods and services, the value. So you just take the price of the goods of their output times the quantity. So a firm purchases 100, costs $2, the value of their output is 200. Go to the next firm, they produce 200 and the price is $4. So there's another $800. You add that up. You just keep doing that across all the firms in the economy. So you just add up the final goods and service. Now you only count organized markets. And so if something's sold on the black market, it gets missed. If you go home and produce dinner for yourself, if you bought it in a restaurant, that would count in GDP because you're paying for it in an organized market. If you go home and do it, it doesn't count. It has to pass through some market. If you hire someone to clean your house, part of GDP because there's an organized market. Unless you pay them under the table to avoid taxes or something like that, that's more of a black market or an underground market. Those wouldn't get counted. If you clean the house yourself, not going to get counted. So it has to go through an organized market, it's produced within the US borders, and it's a given period of time. So you could measure GDP daily, the output of a day, a quarter, a week, a year. We usually measure output either quarterly, that's the most frequent we can get in the national income accounts, or annually are the most common measures. So here's the amount we produced last quarter, here's the amount we produced last year, is the way. The second way to do this is say GDP is the sum of the, we'll do examples of these shortly, so you can see how they work. Some of the value added, again, in organized markets, I'll leave that off, it's understood, it's the same thing. Some of the value added during a given period of time, in organized markets during a given period of time. So we take up what's called the value added across all firms. And if we add that all up, we're going to get a measure for GDP. The third way to do this, where's my eraser? Ah, there it is. So the third way to measure GDP is the sum of all incomes earned in organized markets in a given period of time. So if we add up all the wages, interest, profits, and other income across the entire economy for a whole year, here's what each sector earned, here's the total wages, total interest, total profits, total rents. Add those all up, that should equal GDP. Theoretically, they're identical. One's called, in the national incomes accounts, one's called gross domestic product, one's called GDI, and theoretically GDI, gross domestic income, and gross domestic product should be equal, but they're calculated from completely different data sources, and there's a statistical discrepancy, a small one. But you could measure it either way. Sometimes there's some people that don't look at either one individually, they look at the average of GDP and GDI as though that's a more meaningful statistic, but most people focus on GDP. But anyway, those ought to be exactly the same thing. So let me do an example from the text. So this is an example from the text. Okay, so how does this work? So firm 1 produces steel from raw materials using workers and machines. It sells the steel for 100. Okay? So it sells the steel for 100. It pays workers 80. So that means if the output was $100 worth and the workers were paid 80, the return to the capitalist who owns the machines, the profit is going to be 20. So profit is 20. So the sum of the incomes equals the output. Income equals GDP. Again, we'll see this more explicitly later. Okay, so that's firm 1. I'm not going to be able to leave this all on the board because I'm out of room, but you can always scroll back and forth on the video if you need to. So what does firm 2 do? Firm 2 takes those inputs. So firm 2 uses 100 in steel. So it uses the 100 in steel produced by firm 1 along with workers and machines to produce cars. Now cars have a lot more inputs than just steel, but we're making it simple. So the only thing they need is steel. Just for the example, that's fine. In the real world, this would of course be a lot more complicated, but it would work out much the same. Along with workers and machines, to produce cars, it sells for $200. Okay, it pays workers $70. So what's the profit in this case? Well, it sold the output for $200, but it paid $100 for the steel. And so it only made $100. 70 went to workers, so that leaves 30 for profit for the firm. It's the 200, that's what it sells its stuff for, minus the 100 for steel, minus the 70 for wages, equals the $30 in profit. So there's the output it sells. Here's its input cost. It paid that much for the steel, paid that much to the workers, so what's left over is 30. Okay? So now what is aggregate output is the question. And how can we measure it in these three different ways? Well, for the first way, what is GDP? If we're only going to measure the final goods and services. Okay, now firm one produced 100 in steel, and if we recall, that was 80 in wages and 20 in profit. Firm 2 produced 200 in cars, and of that it had 70 in wages and 30 in profit. So the first point is the total output in the economy is not 100 from the first firm and 200 from the second firm. It's only final goods and services. So that if you look at that definition, I sure hope I got it in there, it should say final goods and services. This is an intermediate good that's used in here. That 200 includes the 100 steel in it already. The 200 is part of it. If we were to add these and these, we'd be double counting. So the GDP is not 300. GDP is just the value. So by method one, GDP is just the 200. The value of the final goods and services produced in, say, this was a month or a year or something like that, some time period. And this is organized market. They sold the cars. They weren't black market cars or anything like that. So GDP, according to the first definition, is $200. Now, what about the value-added approach? The idea here, actually, if you want, let me go back to the first one. You can see this another way by letting these two firms merge into one firm. The merger shouldn't affect the value of GDP. It just determines who owns what. If we were to merge these two firms, this firm would be going out and collecting steel, producing it internally, then using that steel to make cars. It would have a wage bill that was 80, 150. It would have profits of 50, but that firm would still only produce $200 worth of outputs, even if it merged with other firms. We just don't count those intermediate goods as part of GDP to avoid double counting. And again, this example is in your book. Okay, the other way. So this is the total value. This was good. This was method one. The other way is the value-added approach. So what firm one does is it takes raw materials worth nothing. It just goes out in the world and finds all these rocks and things out there, or whatever. And somehow it takes that stuff worth zero and turns it into $100 worth of steel, something people can use. So the value added for firm one is $100. Now I wish the numbers were a little bit different, but I'm going to stay with the book's numbers. Now what does firm two do? Firm two takes this $100 worth of inputs, it takes this steel, and it takes its machines and its labor, and it does something internally, and turns those into $200 worth of output. So for firm one, the value added that's for firm one. For firm two, it takes 100 in steel and turns it into 200 in cars. So it's adding $100 of value. So for the first firm has a value add of 100. The second firm also has a value added of 100. And so GDP is the sum of the value added. It's just the $200 total. So you can get the same answer by looking at the value added approach. Oh, let's not get into that. I was going to talk about the fact that Europe does that with its value-added tax. So it takes what you're taxed on is the difference between what you sell your good at and what you paid for your inputs. So you get a value-added tax. The third way is to add up all of the incomes, and that should also equal GDP. Does it? Well, let's see if it does. Let's see. The first firm, so let's sum of it. Let's sum the incomes. This is method 3. The first firm had 80 in wages and 20 in profit. The second firm had 70 in wages and 30 in profits. And if we add those all up, once again, we get 200. And so we can get the same answer by adding up income, by adding up value added, or by just looking at the total value of the final goods and services, throwing away all the intermediate goods that are out there. The reason this works is when you sell a good, what happens? Okay, so you sell a good for $100, say. You take part of that and pay interest, part of that and pay rent, part of that goes to wages. Anything that's left over is profit. So if I add up all those things, it has to equal the value of what was produced. Because the residual, you just take the value of what was produced, you pay all your inputs. I pay for the building and rent, I pay for the capital equipment I had to borrow for through interest, you have some other costs, I pay all those costs. Those are people's incomes, and everything that's left over is my income, which is profit. And so because that profit's just the residual, it has to be the case that if I add up all these other incomes, the rental income for the landlord, the interest income for the person lending you money, the wage income for the people working for you, subtract that all off the final goods and services, I have to be left with profit. So they have to sum to the same value. It's a bit more complicated when there's inventories involved because some goods aren't actually sold. That's a complication we'll talk about later, but it doesn't fundamentally change the story. Essentially, the national income accounts act as though the firm sold that good to itself, and it all washes out. But we'll come to that later because what happens to inventories will turn out to be important in a moment. Not in a moment, but it'll turn out to be important at some point. All right. Let's stay with GDP and look at nominal. That's not a very good N. Nominal versus real GDP. So this is all stuff you should have seen before, but we're just going over some basic concepts. Some of you might not have taken this for a while or forgotten. So it's good to sort of remind ourselves what these concepts mean so that we're all on the same page. What we've been talking about so far is nominal GDP. I haven't put that N in front of it, but basically we've been talking about nominal GDP. Suppose there's N different goods and services in the economy. So, one is razor blades, and one is eggs, and one is cars, and one is brooms, and all the possible goods and services. Nominal GDP is just the sum over all of those n goods. So from I equals 1 to n, there's n goods, of the price of the goods times the quantity of the goods. So that's PIQI, if my writing's a little sloppy. So nominal GDP is just the dollar value of the goods and services in the economy. It can change for two reasons. One, prices change. Or two, quantities change. So, yeah, it can change for those two reasons. And sometimes what we want to know is, how does the amount of stuff that's out there that we can actually consume change? We're not interested in how much prices change so much as the quantities change. How much stuff is there? Are there more or less bicycles than before? Are there more and less cars than before? Are there more and less of this or that than before? And so what is the real GDP? So if we want to know about just quantities and not prices, that's something called real GDP. So real GDP attempts to capture just changes in real stuff in quantities. And let's look at this with an example. Again, this is an example from the book. So we'll look at the difference between nominal and real GDP and how they're calculated. So let's suppose there's 3 years. So we're going to put up a table here. There's year. There's the quantity of cars. Price of cars. Nominal GDP. And real GDP. So the year is going to be 2000, 3 years, 2004, 2005, 2006. Quantities are 10, 12, 13. Maybe those are in millions or something. We're just trying to make it simple. The price of cars is 20,000 in this year, 24,000 in this year, and 26,000 in this year. So nominal GDP in each of these years, there's only one good in the economy. If there were two goods, we'd just do, we're going to take price times quantity. We would just add up, do the same thing for both goods. So in this year, the nominal GDP is 200,000. This is 12 times 24, which is 288,000. And the last one is 338,000. So nominal GDP is rising, but it's rising for two reasons. Not only are quantities going up, prices are going up. If we want to measure real GDP, what should we do? Well, what you first have to do is pick a base year. We'll use 2005 as the base year. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the price in the base year, this 24,000, and we're going to multiply it by each of these quantities. Oops, missed. And so 10 times 24 will be 240,000. 12 times 24, again, since this is the base year, it's going to be the same. 288,000. And this will be 13 times 24, which is 312? Yeah, 312,000. This number, because we're using the same price, is only changing because of quantities. So we can talk about this change here is a 20% change. 48, yes, because 10% is 24, 20% is 48, 48 plus that is 288. So what we've had is a 20% growth. Notice here, you can see it here too. 20% of 10 is 2, so 10 plus 2 is 12. So this is a 20% growth rate. We can get this out of our real GDP measure. Excuse me. The second one, this is 8% here. So we have a 20% growth right here and 8% growth right here. Now in this case, we could also look at the quantity. This is also 1/12, or that's about 8% as well. It's approximate, not quite exactly. 12 times 8 is 96. There's 4, yeah, anyway, it's close. So in this case, we could measure it by looking at the real stuff, which is what we're interested in, or real GDP. Now, if there were two goods, like cars and bicycles, we'd take the quantity, for 2004, we'd take the quantity of bicycles times its price, and we'd add these two things up to get nominal GDP. There'd be different quantities here. Maybe one quantity is going up and one quantity is going down, but real GDP is still going to give us an answer about how much, in terms of dollar value, is the real stuff changing, the real value of bicycles and cars together. And so in that case, it'd be harder. You can't just look at the quantities to get a simple answer about growth in real GDP, but you can look at this number over here to get that. So again, how would those numbers, this is 20% growth, 8% growth. Suppose I picked a different base year. What if I use 2004 as my base year? How does that affect my estimates of the base of the growth rates? It doesn't. It doesn't make a darn bit of difference which base year I choose. I'll get the same answer. I'll get different values for real GDP, but from period to period, I'll get exactly the same growth rates. And so for GDP growth, it doesn't matter what your base year is. You're going to get exactly the same answer. So real GDP tells us how Q is changing over time. Nominal GDP tells us how Q and P together are changing over time. And sometimes that's just not what we want to know. Okay, the next thing in the book is, what if there's more than one good? Let me talk a little bit about that, a little more than I already have. So what if there's more than one good in the economy? Suppose there's two goods, A and B. How do you go from real to nominal in that case? Well, you should use relative prices, the price of A over the price of B. If a good costs twice as much, so if this PA over PB, this is $10, this is $5, it should count twice as much for the final, it should count twice as much in the calculation of real GDP. So you add up the value of all the goods, but you weighted on how big its price is. So in our real GDP measure, cars get a lot more weight than toothpicks, which seems to make sense, because they're a much bigger part of your expenditures, and so you want to know that. Now the problem with this is these relative prices change over time. So how do we handle that? It's discussed in the appendix, but they use what's called a real GDP in chain dollars. So what you essentially end up doing is take the average of the relative prices over a period of time and using those in your weights of final GDP. And that turns out to be a fairly good way of getting a value for real GDP. But anyway, I don't want to focus too much on this because we're just getting into the details here that we don't really need to know for the stuff we're going to do later. But just realize that it's a little more complicated when you have more than one good. You have to weight the goods by the ratio of their prices. Those ratios change over time. To solve that, they use what's called chain-weighted real GDP, which is just averages the relative prices for some time period. Okay, some symbols. YT will be defined as real GDP at time t. PT will be the price level, as we call it. We'll talk about how that's determined in a little while. PT, YT will be nominal GDP. Now, some terminals, the book also uses, I don't like the notation much, but the book also uses dollar YT to emphasize that this is just the dollar value of GDP. It's not the real value. It's just it's a nominal, it's the amount you actually spend out there. But, so the book will use dollar YT as nominal GDP. Sometimes this is called GDP in constant dollars. This is called GDP in current dollars, today's dollars. Because remember, we calculate real GDP, we pick a base year for our price levels. There's other terminology here, but let's not worry too much about it. Let me show you something here. It'll take me a second to pull it up, but just take a look at a graph between real GDP and nominal GDP that I have back here. If I can get it to come up. It'll take a second. I think it ought to be coming up here. Where's the light? There it is. Oh, now it's going to tell me that I need to change the filter. This will go away in a second. Sorry about that. A little bit of a pause here. So you can see there is some difference. They tend to move together. Real GDP is a little more volatile. And sometimes the growth rates are going to be quite a bit different. Real GDP right here is very flat. It's not growing at all. Yet nominal GDP is going up. That's the 1970s when we had a huge inflation rate and a stagnant economy. That's the 73, 74 recession. So real GDP wasn't growing at all. But if you were just looking at nominal GDP, you tend to think, oh, gee, the economy is really booming. And so, but it wasn't. It was just that prices were going up so fast that it was masking the fact that quantities weren't going up at all. Here's another case. This looks like the 82 recession, where real GDP is going down, but nominal GDP is going up. So if you were looking at nominal GDP, you'd go, wow, what a great economy. But if you actually looked at the amount of stuff that was out there, it was less than before. It's actually going down. So you can see other time periods in real and nominal GDP give very different stories. It's real GDP that the Fed and other sorts of people typically worry about. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is the GDP growth rate and how it's calculated. Let me just show you a picture real quick of GDP growth. This is the growth rate. You notice it's very volatile. Sometimes growth is negative, sometimes it's highly positive. Went very quickly from a negative 2% growth rate in the early 80s to an over 6 or 7% growth rate shortly after. That's the 82 recession. There's a 79 recession. There's a 73 recession. There's a 90 recession. There's a 2001 recession. It didn't actually turn negative. There's the beginnings of the Great Recession. Finally, we get a rebound here. But you can see for a long time, GDP growth was falling. It even was falling. Remember, the Great Recession didn't start until 2007, about here. But real GDP was actually warning us a little before that, as early as 2004, 2005. that we had some problems. But anyway, there's some pictures of those things. Let me shut this off. So how do you calculate real GDP? So GDP level versus GDP growth. So what we've been talking about so far is the level of GDP, either real or nominal. How would you calculate the growth rate of these variables? So this is a measure of the size of the economy. GDP growth is a measure of how that size is changing over time. Another thing that you often look at, let me just talk about different measures while we're here, is real GDP per capita. So you take a nation's real GDP and you divide it by their populations. For instance, we might have heard that China's economy is bigger than the US now. Yeah, if you just measure total output. But if you look at GDP per capita, they're about 50, 60, 70 years behind. Their GDP per person is way lower than the US's because they have more GDP, but they also have a heck of a lot more people. And so GDP per capita is usually a much better measure of the standard of living. So when we want to talk about the standard of living, it's GDP per capita that we're interested in. If we want to know how that standard of living is changing over time, we're going to want to know how real GDP per capita is growing or not growing. So to measure growth year to year, so real GDP growth, what you remember, YT is the formula for it. YT is real GDP at time t minus real GDP at t minus 1 last year or last quarter, depending on the time period, over the base year. So real GDP growth is just the change over the old level. It's a standard way to measure it. You can also measure this, I won't go through it, but you can also measure it as the log of YT minus the log of YT minus 1. So when I'm doing econometrics and I want to measure growth rates, and I don't have to worry about negative numbers, with GDP it's never going to be negative. You can't produce a negative amount of stuff. This is a way that you can quickly get the growth rates. It works because d log, this is an approximation of d log y, and d log y is the change in y over y, which is the percentage change. If you followed that, great. You've had enough calculus. If you didn't follow that, no problem at all. This is what you need to know here. That's how you measure the growth. Okay, a little bit more. I want these lectures to be about an hour long, and so I'm 8 minutes short of an hour, but if I start this next section, I don't think I can finish it in an hour. So what I'm going to do is break it here and come back and do a part 2 of this introduction. This is like 2 lectures in week 1, I guess. And sometimes I'll run a little longer than an hour, depending upon how the material breaks. But I want to try to keep them, in that hour 20 range, or near an hour if I can. So I'm going to stop here and pick this back up with lecture 2. So thank you.